Hi everyone, today we're going to go through a co-working feasibility process. I almost want to role play this, so pretend you've given me a call or I'm running a feasibility through your building. This is a high level checklist of the things that I'm going to ask you or even send over as a form for you to fill so that I can take a first stab at what co-working could look like for your building. But more importantly, it just gives me a bit more context about what your aspirations are, what type of deal structure would work for you, how much space, blah, blah, blah. So what I thought would be useful is while I go through this checklist, I also have a model next to me, which I'll chuck up on the screen to show you how we can change some of those inputs depending on this FISO process and therefore the type of business case that it'll spit out. We'll look at this as a well, we'll go through it as we go through the list, actually. I was going to validate which market we're looking at, but it's going to come out when we go through this list. Okay, so the co-working feasibility process, I always like to start with the asset profile. Actually, that's not true. I like to start with the commercial, the commercials, which is always important, but truth be told, the asset profile always comes out first. Because when I do get approached by a landlord or an entrepreneur trying to set up their own operation, they always have an asset in mind. So we're going to hypothetically look at an asset in, let's just say it's in, rub that out, in Australia. For now, it's in Melbourne. Just because we've looked at so many opportunities in Melbourne, Australia, great market for it, and we've got a number of sites there. The total NLA is for the building, right? And this is always interesting to understand because, and I'll get to it, it impacts the way a landlord looks at certain deal types, especially management agreement structures, when they're considering co-working. So let's say the total NLA of this is 15,000 square meters. We're going to work in square meters for this video. You can convert it to square feet if you'd like. But let's work in that metric because it's an Australian site. Then I normally ask, hey, what floor are you thinking of within this building, right? And they normally will, if it's a new development, they might play around with you and be like, what floor would you like? In which case a lot of operators opt for the lower floors because they can try and integrate it with the ground floor solution or have some sort of ground floor presence if they want to mess around with concierge services to increase their fee earning potential, or even a cafe to capture on-site street traffic to make the margin higher and make that business work. But normally, if you're looking at this, if you're not involved in a new development, it will be a floor that is probably a problematic floor for that landlord. One that they haven't been able to fill or one that is coming up on a vacancy, right? So let's say, just for argument's sake, we'll go for it to make this simple, a single floor. So we'll go one floor and we'll say it's just level 5, right? I think I've got, do I have the NLA of the floor here? No, so I'll put, let's say this is, just to make it nice and round numbers, a 1,500 square meter floor. So about 10% of the total NLA of the asset, right? And that's interesting. It's very market specific and market dependent, but generally for an owner, especially if they plan on hanging on to that asset and care about the valuation for their borrowing power and their portfolio value, if they're going to entertain a co-working space, especially under a partnership style structure, so a management agreement style deal, it generally has to be 10% or less of the total NLA of the asset. Because the way valuations work currently, because they like to work off historical data and not future, is whatever income you're projecting for this co-working business, they're going to give it a slight haircut because it's variable income, it's not rent. So therefore, if only 10% of their building is getting a 15% haircut on the rent that they're earning on that floor, the income, the overall value of that building doesn't take a huge hit. Also, there's certain tax implications and all that kind of stuff we won't get into. I've got other videos and that stuff, so if you're interested, you can find it within the library on my channel, Flex for Thought. But also the model that we're going to be messing around with, I'll start updating it now. 1,500 square meters is what we said. There's a free version for you if you go into the link in the description. There's a bunch of free materials for you to check out. So it's 1,500 square meters. The desk density I've preset to 6.5 square meters, which could be denser. I mean, many operators shoot for as low as 5.5, which means you get more desks. So currently we're working with 2.31 desks, 231 desks, but we'll keep it to that for now, unless we need to rejig it once we figure out what the commercial targets are for this landlord. I like to ask what anchor tenants are in the building. So in this hypothetical, let's say it's media, because it is important to understand in case there's certain amenities that you can put into your co-working floor plan that you've got space for that can accommodate not just your members, but also the anchor tenants within the building. So you can help the landlord out. There might be some anchor tenants in this media example, for example, that want access to a 30-person private event space, right? Or certain additional podcasting or media facilities. So imagine if you put that within your co-working NLA, that makes the landlord happy, but also gets those anchor tenants coming into your space, which you can then upsell meeting rooms, all that kind of stuff. They become part of the community, which is great. Vacancy, I always like to ask because are you dealing with a 100% let up asset? Are you dealing with a 20%, 30%? Are you trying to solve a problem here? Let's say under this hypothetical, it's 60% vacancy. Sorry, this chair is it still gonna squeak? No, okay, it's good. Around 60% vacancy, because first of all, there's going to be some assumptions that you put within the model that will go through, like meeting room usage that you could normally bake into just what your members use. But if you've got a 100% commercial building that they're going to use certain meeting rooms, you can push that percentage utilization a bit higher. But also, if it's only 60% vacancy, there's an opportunity to speak to the landlord and be like, hey, how can we help you fill the rest of that building? Is there an incubator effect type of understanding here? Meaning if there's a co-working customer that outgrows the co-working space, do we do a deal where we, instead of trying to ship them off to another co-working operator or another building, we work with your leasing agents to put it into your building first? And do we get compensated for that? Or what's the dynamic there? Or are you more lenient with the deal levers when we negotiate this management agreement? Because we're going to be doing that, right? Which comes into the special clauses, which we'll get into later. So that's the asset profile done. Let's go into rent target. I always this is really important. It almost, for anyone considering co-working or new sites, you reverse engineer what the size of the space, the layout of the space, even your aspirations for experience needs to be, and how you're going to profile that product mix based on what the rent target, the owner's rent target they're going to expect, right? Because you need to make enough money to cover all your costs, take out the fees that you need to be happy and hungry as an operator, but then still achieve that rent target, which has got escalations year on year. Let's not forget that, right? Within Australia, it's around 3.7% right now. So every year that rent increases. So you should also be thinking about increasing your pricing year on year, which can be tough in co-working, right? Excuse me. So let's say, for argument's sake, the rent target is $700 net per square meter. Okay. Outgoings is also important to understand because it's a cost, right? Depending on where you're watching, outgoings is like triple N costs, it's building costs. It's generally the cost to clean, upkeep all the communal areas within the building, all of that kind of stuff. So let's say this is $100 per square meter. So if I go into the model here, scroll, 100, and we will go, right now it's set to 800, so $700 a square meter net. I might actually pull, no, I was going to talk about rent hurdle, but I won't. I'll wait till we get to the deal structure part, okay? So we're starting to just put some of these deal drivers in, and once we get to the end of the co-working feasibility process, I'll pull you directly into the model and we can talk through that together, okay? CapEx, if I go down here, what is this going to cost within the Australian Melbourne market? Let's say this is semi-premium. You can use a finger to wind. Let's say it's $2,400 a square meter for now. It's important to understand what this cost is because, again, it depends on your market. But within Australia, the landlord, majority of the time, if they're entertaining this, is on the hook for the CapEx under a management agreement deal, because they ultimately own the space. The whole point of this partnership style structure is they want it to look and feel a bit like their building, serve their tenant community. They essentially own this business and the capital, the CapEx that's put into it, the fit out, so they should be fronting it, right? But also the reason why it makes sense for them within the Australian market is very generally within a traditional lease deal, there's an incentive that's provided. right? And this could be as high as 39%. So if you sign a 7 to 10 year long-term lease as a traditional tenant, the landlord will give you the value of up to 39% of that as a combination of cash up front for you to do your fit out, but also to abate your rent over that tenure that you agree to, okay? So in their mind, even though you're not a long-term tenant paying the rent, they should be in a position now, especially because management agreement deals have been around since I've started doing this about 7 years ago, where they go, okay, well, in theory, I would give X amount of dollars to you if you're a long-term tenant. So I'm willing to look at that value, even if I discount it slightly because you're not paying me guaranteed rent, but there's other advantages of doing this with you to kind of wipe out the capex, at least on their, when they look at the ROI of this business case. So if I go here, capex, we've got it as 2,300, 2,400. So for example, that current calculation, if that's correct, I'd have to double check, but yeah, it looks right, is about, they would normally provide 2.5 million as a tenant incentive under these deal assumptions to a long-term tenant. If it's 2,400 bucks a square meter across 1,500 square meters, you could probably do it cheaper, but because it's a smaller space, you don't get the economies of scale of those cheaper build rates than you do if you do like a 3,000 square meter site. So always remember that. The capex is around 3.6 million, assuming they want this to be a high-end offering. And so basically, as the owner, they go, okay, 3.6, subtract 2.5, that's where you've got your 1.18. That's the number that they're trying to claw back on top of their rent equivalent, right, that they've put in front of us, which is about 700 bucks a square meter plus the 100 bucks outgoing. So it's important to understand that within your market, because you might be in a market where there is no incentives and the landlord's like, I'm not going to pay for this capex. Well, then who's going to cover that 3.6 million? And it's going to be different numbers for your market, because I've looked at this in markets like India, Saudi Arabia, Guatemala, US and all that kind of stuff. Everyone's different. So if someone's on the hook for the capex, you then need to revisit your numbers to appreciate that you've got to make enough money way above the rent targets of what the landlord wants and what your management fee is for running this to get like a 3-year payback on that capex to whoever's investing it, right? So always keep that in mind. But for the purpose of this one, we're going to act as if it's in Australia and you get a chunk of that capex just written off because of the way they do incentives. It's crazy, I know. It's crazy. Tenure, rule of thumb, 5-year plus 5-year option. That's what I always lead with my deals. And also when I'm even consulting with landlords trying to understand what kind of deal they should do. The reality is if the operator's doing really well and the landlord's happy, you want to keep them in there as long as possible, like 10 years plus, right? Because the fit out's also going to be designed in a way, if you spend that money up front, that you're not going to have to spend that money all over again. You just need light refreshers, maybe a heavier one in year 6, right? But the 5-year plus 5 years really to protect both the operator and the landlord. After 5 years, assuming everything's good, it just gives an opportunity for the landlord to be like, this isn't really working for me, or I want to do something different, and vice versa with the operator. The operator needs a minimum of 5 years in my view, because the first year is the ramp up, which is all the hard work. The second year is retention, which I would argue is even harder, because the first year of ramp up, you're just throwing discounts at people to fill the space. I've seen it happen so many times where certain operators go way too heavy on the discounts, in fact, give it away for free. And then by the time the second year comes around where they try and renew them, they're like, nah, sorry. I enjoyed the free office while it was free, but I'm not going to convert now to a high number to them because they're used to getting it for free. Right, so second year is hard because let's say you add a 15 to 20% discount if someone signs the 6 to 12 month license with your space, you then need to, on the second year, renew them, but to the original rate that you've budgeted for. Because otherwise you're going to be in a scenario where you might be like 80% occupied, but way behind your 80% projections because all the rates are way discounted. So food for thought, I like to bake in discounts into my modeling, which I have in this. But it's food for thought for you when you do yours, okay? So that really means the 3rd year to 5th year, that's where you earn your fees. So the first 2 years are like, well, so 5 years makes it worth it for an operator. Market fit, I always like to ask what target industries, right? So for this particular one, even though the anchor tenants are media, Does that mean the owner wants media companies within the building? Don't know, you got to ask. They might say there's certain industries that the anchor tenants are interested in getting closer to. Like, let's say you've got a media tenant, like a big news company or something like that within this building, and they've made it clear that they want to get closer to certain technology companies or wellness companies, and they've got another 5 years on their lease. You know, how cool would it be if suddenly the co-working management agreement deal that you've got going with them as part of a partnership understanding is that you try and attract some of those industries as well on top of your target community. So let's just say wellness and tech. And that doesn't mean you have to go hard only on those, but you know, you make an effort to almost potentially design areas of the floor to really cater for those industries, or chuck in some amenities there to help the anchor, right? Competition, just look at the radius around the space and also what their occupancy percentage is. That's a really good tell of, you know, the type of businesses that you're going to be competing with. When you look at the occupancy percentage, try and get their desk rates if possible as well, even if you just have to do some mystery shopping. Because just because the site's 90% full doesn't mean it's cash flow, you know, has great cash flow, because they could be doing crazy discounts and just chucking people in there, right? So competition is always something important to understand, because there might be scenarios where it doesn't mean you don't do it just because there's competition around you and they're doing okay, because it's all around product positioning and who you're trying to target and all that kind of stuff as well. But what it does mean is the original opportunity that you may have been considering to be a 3,000 square meter site, it might be more frugal to be a 1,200 square meter site to start with, right? Then smash that out, get to 100% within 6 to 8 months, get a wait list, and then speak to the landlord about phasing in another floor or half floor, right? So I think that's always really important when you're considering competition. Doesn't mean don't do it, because you might be positioning your product differently, but it does mean be a bit more thoughtful on the size. Go live date, it's always good to understand when they want this thing to go live. There's been a plethora of conversations I've had where we're having a fee zone, they're like, can this be up and running in 5-6 months? It's like, dude, let's just get a reality check going here. Because sometimes it's important, because if everything looks good and everyone wants to do it, but the landlord's pushing or the customer's pushing for you to get it in within 5-6 months and you just know you can't do it, contracts and figuring all that stuff alone is going to take 1 to 2 months, to be honest, before you even get the detailed design and the build going, which is why sometimes I like to do deal structures where things happen in congruence, right? So if you've got your timeline and it's go live here and it's contracts here, and you know contracts are going to take this much time, almost up to month 3, right, before you get your go live, 8 to 10 month, very aggressive, well, maybe you do detailed design while you're doing contracts. You know, you do that in congruence. You take that out of the full appointment if you're okay with giving some of that IP up, as long as they pay for it. And while you've got your lawyers trying to undo a great deal, because that's what lawyers are great at doing. You know, there's a saying, if you ever want to fuck up a great deal, get lawyers involved. And I take that back, because I've got a lot of friends who are great lawyers. It was just a horrible joke. Is maybe you do your detailed design, you pull some of that work forward. So you do it at the same time, right? But it's taken out of that and you get paid for it. So go live date really depends on project to project. Deal structure. All right, I might actually jump into the model for this part, because this will be fun, because I haven't done this before. We've prepped this earlier. So with these deal triggers being chucked in, it might be a really shit deal unless we just make up, oh, it costs this much and this is but you should never do that. But I'll quickly fill this in as I go. But the model is going to be a management agreement structure, which is why we've got these other deal things going on here. But before we go into rev share, profit share, let's have a quick look at these inputs. 6.5, I reckon we can go for six square meters. So 250 desks. I think 6 square meter density is quite nice, especially if we're assuming we're not dealing with a horrible floor and we've got a kind of nice floor going on. You know, you need to see the floor. There's been times where I've been told hey, you got 1,500 square meters. I'm like, that sounds great. Okay, that sounds like a good number for economies of scale. And then the floor looks like this weird horseshoe with columns everywhere, things built up close to the facade, so your offices can't even go up to the glass, which is like, co-working 101 in some cases because you want the view and the natural light and everything. And it just killed the whole thing because it was like, I've got 1,500 square meters that you're going to be charging me rent for, but there's only like 900 of it usable for a co-working style floor plan. This has clearly been designed. You've done your best with the floor plan, but clearly designed for a single tenant. So you got to really check that stuff. So let's go with 6. Because it's 1,500 square meters, I'm going to say we only need 2 head count. So we'll go community manager, center manager. It'll be a hybrid of community manager and concierge, but you only need 2 people. I'm happy with 85% occupancy and a 12-month ramp up because it's a smaller site. If you want to be conservative, we can even go 15-month ramp up. Meeting room occupancy, 20%. Yeah, sure. I mean, let's dock this to 18% just to be conservative because under this scenario, it's only 60% vacancy and it's not a huge asset, right? So that allows you to also assume you're giving a lot of those meeting room credits away for free. Corporate events, member events, 5 and 8%, sure. So we've split this up into the private office desks, 85%. 85% of the, oh no, my son just woke up. As in, he's not a hellraiser, he's gorgeous, but only 45 minutes. He's been trying to drop a nap. So we're doing 1 nap a day, but that means that nap needs to be like an hour and a half, 2 hours, but he just woke up 45 minutes. Oh no. Ugh. All right, early bed today, early bath and bed. Where was I? 85% of the 250 are 213 private office desks, and then we've got about 15% of it open plan. I don't really like to go heavy on the open plan desks because they aren't as reliable as selling private office desks longer term. And we've got 10 hot desks, sure. Pricing, $800. Let's drop this to $750 because the rent seems lower. So because the rent's only $700, it seems to be in like a suburban or just off CBD fringe area, same as the outgoings, which means the open plan desk should be really $600. Meeting rooms, yeah, I'm happy with this. 1 12-person, 1 6 to 8, 2 4Ps, 1 podcast studio. We'll shave this pricing a little bit. 50, yep. And then the event space, we've got, yeah, cool. Events don't really generate that much revenue anyway, so we're fine here. Skip. No co-working cafe in this one because we're on level 5. If we do a cafe, it's going to be a very light one. Skip down to, what are we looking at? I'll go to the sample dashboard. Okay, so we already know that right now, without changing a lot of the cost drivers, it's a very lucrative opportunity because if you look here, the target rent should be $725. Whereas we're making $917 in year 2, so the delta is $192. Okay, so that automatically tells me when I look at this, because this is a hypothetical, we're missing a couple of things because it shouldn't be that high, right? So that might be an opportunity if this was a real thing to go, hey, let's have a real look at competitive pricing in that area. And you might say, hey, you know what? 750 is a bit high. I think we'll go 700. And we'll have an 80% discount in year 2. But in year 3, let's have at least a 10% discount recurring, right? So that we know our team can always do deals. And we know the open plan desks are only $550, right? And then you might go down here because we've got advanced IT and connectivity services as well as ancillary revenue. Here we go. So the ancillary revenue is $15,000 a month, which was from a previous model that I looked at. We're going to change this back to like $2,000. The reason it was so high is because that opportunity I was looking at once upon a time ago, they had so many different product offerings that they were selling separate to the desks in the meeting rooms, like digital product offerings, educational platforms, courses. The co-working business essentially was almost like the physical brick and mortar space to bring the people there, but they had such a crazy online business. And we just wanted to really quickly look at numbers. So rather than break it up into all these different line items, they just gave me that monthly recurring revenue to chuck in. So See, this is you kind of see, you kind of know when you do enough of these, going, hey, that looks way too good. Okay, this looks a lot better. It doesn't, because we're seeing red. The delta by year 2, we're only $678, so we're $47. But now I'm kind of like, okay, this makes more sense, right? So we're actually behind, which isn't the end of the world, right? Because there's certain things that you can change to make this a bit better without doing financial jujitsu, making shit up essentially. And I think the key thing could be, all right, well, do I challenge my team to push the desk rate to actually $750, because now we've included a 20% discount and a 10% discount. So even though it's listed at $750 a desk, which seems to be okay, we've budgeted that every desk within an office is sold at $675. So we're going in knowing those desks are going to be hit with a 10% discount every time you do a deal, right? So the reality is, even though the model says $750, so your team can market it for that per desk, and that's blended, by the way. So you might have some $900 desks, some $500, depending on where they are around the floor plate. That looks a bit better. Sure. I mean, we won't change too much more than that. I think the deal's the deal at this point. Okay, so with that slight change, and remember we're at 6 square meters, here's the power of density. A lot of the larger operators in the market can achieve 5.5 because they just really know their product offering and how they can cram stuff in. If you change it to 5.5, just to show you, you've now got 23 extra desks to throw around. Yeah, now we're $100 over. So this is why a lot of the larger operators try and just cram shit in, because suddenly it looks really good. But the warning is, if you do that, it's not as simple as a spreadsheet where you can just fill the thing. It might not look that good, right? Because people aren't going to want to buy a desk in an ant farm. So what did I have here? So I went off on a tangent, but if we go to the revenue share, I've got it set to 7%, which I like for a deal this size, because as an operator, if you look here, you're earning about 144K by year 2 once it hits 85% occupancy. We've got a rent hurdle here of 33%. So we'll start at that. So 33% of 700, which is equal to 231. So the rent hurdle's 231, which means as the revenue pays and covers all of these cost line items, $231 of that rent is either guaranteed or you prioritize on the waterfall cash flow payment. And there's a difference, right? Guaranteed, because if you as an operator are willing to do a rent deal, you just say, I'll pay you a third of the rent, and the rest of the stuff will make up as turnover through the profit share arrangement. Or if you're not going to do that deal and you're saying, hey, we're not going to take a lease at all, you say at least a third of that rent will identify as a cost line item that's way up high in the waterfall payment structure. Waterfall payment structure just means, like, if this is the waterfall and the money is coming down, you've got some of your costs up here, but then you've got your rent hurdle here, and then you've got your profit share here. So it's almost like before we start sharing some of the profit and even the revenue, we'll cover that first. So it's a way how you can give some landlords some comfort and certainty if you're not going to do a lease deal. And then profit share I've got set as 8% to the co-working operator, 92% to the owner, which I think is fine. For this, it's fine. 8% to co-working operator, because the landlord's covering the capital, right? Whereas if you were covering the capital as the operator, a lot of these percentages would change, because you'd need to see more to get the ROI of your CapEx, right? And the landlord might be happier getting less of their rent target, depending again which market you're looking at, because they're not putting that risk in. You are. So all these deal levers matter, and I've got a video that specifically looks at how you negotiate those deal levers if you go to my channel. I think it's very obviously titled like deal lever scenario, whatever. And then if I look at the special clauses, it's just really simple stuff. Like especially if you're a relatively new operator, one with a small footprint, and you want a big deal, I'd say exclusivity is a big one that I like to throw around. Tivity. So you won't open another co-working space within a certain vicinity or period of time while you're working with them. And it could be just to protect the first 3 years of operation. It doesn't have to be in perpetuity. You could be like, okay, within the first 2 years, I'm not going to set another one up, so I can just focus on really building this one within the area, this certain area. X kilometers, I like to do that deal because then it shows the owner that, especially if it's a building I like in a market and I'm not really in a rush to open a second one, it's an advantage for you as a small to medium operator that you're not going to be tempted or seduced by taking some of the customers in that operation and putting it in another one nearby that you also run that might need a bit more help, right? And then the other special clause could be tenant priority. So they might have some anchor tenants that want to use certain need offices in case they grow, and they want to prioritize that usage, which means you may need to keep 5-10% of that office stock always on hand, or you might do it as a quick turnover space within the floor plan. So whatever customers you chuck in there, you could be like, hey, I can boot you out in a month's notice, but you get like a 30% discount on these offices. Are you cool with that? So they don't get too comfortable, so you can at least monetize that space. Or there's certain meeting rooms or event spaces or that kind of stuff that you chuck in there that they want to use. Okay, I think that'll do it. Hopefully that was helpful. Sorry for the random interruption about my son waking up. He's only 14 months old, but he's like walking around and talking. It's so wild how quickly he's growing. I forget that he's 14 months old sometimes. Yeah. Anyway, thanks for listening. Hope this was helpful, and I'll speak to you again soon. All captured.